The hospitality here from the Harvey Cedars team has just been so lovely, and being a first-time guest here, I'm excited to return at some point and to continue to experience that hospitality. There are handouts in the back, so I know sometimes we miss them when we come out, but if you're wanting a handout to go along with our time together today, then you can pick that up there in the back. I was talking to Ron just a little bit earlier before this session. We were just commenting on how marvelous it is when the Lord just works together speakers' talks and the things that they cover to really present a cohesive theme. Sometimes you go to a conference and all the talks seem somewhat disparate and not connected, and you can tell people probably haven't talked behind the scenes to coordinate their talks, and we didn't, and yet the Lord has, I think, just done a wonderful thing in really bringing about so many different important facets of what does it look like to deal with discouragement in ministry, suffering in ministry, finishing well in ministry, and what I've loved so much about Steve and Ron and Mark and even to some degree Tim's talks is just the way that everybody reinforced or just caused us to reflect in very deep and meaningful ways about some of these important but hard aspects of ministry. So my goal together in our time together today is to close out our time to talk about navigating hardship, navigating suffering in a season of hardship as someone who's married. I also realize that many of you are here with your spouses. Some of you are not here with your spouses. So those of you who are not here with your spouse, my hope is that you can take some of what we talk about today and take it home and embody it and practice it. And for those of you that are here with your spouse, I think it'll be a wonderful opportunity to grow and to enrich your connection. We've been talking a lot about suffering and hardship, and one of the things I think sometimes that we think about when we think about suffering and hardship is that for most people, it's almost always a negative. It's almost always a net negative in their life. Suffering is something that's negatively experienced. We're oftentimes told that suffering has a negative effect on relationships, especially from a counseling perspective. When you look at difficult and challenging times within the time and space of a marriage, there are certain life events where therapists and counselors will say that almost always will end a marriage when there's long-term fertility or infant loss or infidelity or adultery. When there are difficult things that come on couples, it tends to break them apart. It tends to split them apart. I'm confident when it comes to suffering, though, that there's probably no other audience that understands the topic of suffering more so than you do. You get it, right? You preach about it, you teach about it, you help walk other people through seasons of suffering. But what I oftentimes find in meeting with pastors is that the space between what we preach and what we teach and what we talk to people about in suffering, and then the other space of what we actually experience in our own marriages and in our own lives, that can be an enormous chasm. And it's in that chasm a lot of times where I feel like a lot of husbands and wives oftentimes experience a lot of shame and a lot of embarrassment, meaning that we talk about how to go through suffering, we talk about how to navigate seasons of suffering, and then when we experience it in our own lives, sometimes it's hard to actually practice what we preach. And suffering can be difficult and discouraging, and in that space, it can be embarrassing and shameful sometimes for us to admit that. But what I want to share with all of you today is that that's very normal. You're human beings, you're people. You suffer, you go through difficult hardships. As Ron was mentioning last night, one of the lessons in finishing well is that we should expect seasons of suffering. Suffering doesn't always have to have a negative effect on our relationships, though. While that might be the conventional wisdom, we actually know that suffering can have a positive impact both on our relationships and both on us personally. I think that those were things that both Steve and Ron helped bring out for us so poignantly. Interestingly enough, this teaching, this idea that suffering can actually be a positive for us is something that's also supported just in counseling and in current research. Many of you probably read social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. He's written a lot of different books. But Jonathan Haidt notes that while in the West in particular, suffering has almost always been seen as a negative and something to kind of be adverse to and something that we don't want to have to deal with, he noted in his research with counseling and in meeting with individuals that suffering actually can have positive effects. And I found Haidt's research to be so interesting because I think when I tell you what are the three ways that suffering can have a positive impact on us, what we'll hear is just echoes of biblical truth. So here are the three things that Jonathan Haidt notices about what suffering can do to people. Number one, He said people who tend to go through suffering, who tend to go through difficult things, tend to become more resilient on the other side of it. He said people who go through challenging circumstances, hard circumstances, on the other side of it, people who battle significant anxiety, significant depression, that over time, with help, with therapy, with counseling, he notes that they actually become more resilient and more able to face the difficult challenges of life. Secondly, Haidt notices that suffering tends to change people's priorities and their philosophies. Their priorities and their philosophies, meaning that, the current, I would say, state of American culture in terms of what do we want to pursue, it's just happiness, the good life, the authentic life. He said suffering tends to change that. It tends to help people realize that there has to be something deeper. There has to be a deeper meaning to life than just the pursuit of happiness and just having a good life. It causes people to rearrange those philosophies and those priorities in life. Thirdly, Haidt notices this. He says suffering tends to bond people together. He said people that go through challenging and difficult circumstances, that on the other side of it, if they go through it and are able to travel through it well, what tends to happen, not the conventional wisdom of it breaking apart relationships, Haidt notices that it actually bonds people together, right? People that go through challenging times, people that go through challenging circumstances, whether they be pastors and ministry leaders or ordinary married couples, that suffering and hardship, rather than splitting people apart, can actually join them together, right? You hear as we recount Haidt's notes there that so much of what he says reminds us of things that we already know to be true then from Scripture. Another one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, has probably one of her most famous poems called The Uses of Sorrow. And here's the poem. It's just two simple stanzas. She writes, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness, and it took me years to understand that this too was a gift," right? What Oliver, I think, there is simply echoing is what Haidt's already noticed, that there is something about suffering that rather than following the conventional wisdom of it's always bad, it's always negative, that there's actually something that can be good, that can be redeemed out of it. And so what I'd love for us to do in the time that we have together this morning is to turn in our Bibles to Psalm 31 and see what we can learn from David's journey in suffering and in discouragement. And we'll go through it alongside 5 headings. We'll see that David comes to the Lord. We'll see that David names what is broken. We'll see that David identifies what is good. And then in the final section, we'll see David invites others in and he practices Christian hope. And then what we'll endeavor to do as we move through the psalm towards the end is to make particular application this morning to marriage, to couples, of how can we similarly, like David, go through seasons of hardship. So for our benefit, I just would love for us to read Psalm 31 together, the whole chapter. David writes, "In you, O Lord, do I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me and rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. And for your name's sake, you lead me and guide me. You take me out of the net that they have hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You've known the distress of my soul, and you've not delivered me into the hand of the enemy. You've set my feet in a broad place. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted from grief, my soul and my body also. My life is spent with sorrow, my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. Because of all my adversaries, I've become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street, they flee from me. I've been forgotten like one who is dead. I have become like a broken vessel. For I hear the whispering of many, terror on every side, as they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say you are my God. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors. Make your face shine on your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. O Lord, let me not be put to shame, for I call upon you. Let the wicked be put to shame. Let them go silently to Sheol. Let the lying lips be mute, which speak insolently against the righteous in pride and contempt. Oh, how abundant is your goodness, which you have stored up for those who fear you, and worked for those who take refuge in you, in the sight of the children of mankind. In the cover of your presence you hide them from the plots of men. You store them in your shelter from the strife of tongues. Blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me when I was in a besieged city. I had said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. But you heard the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cried to you for help. Love the Lord, all you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong. Let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. Well, as we go through this, again, we'll come to our first heading here where we see David comes to the Lord. He comes to the Lord here in Psalm 31. Commentators have noted that Psalm 31 is a bit of an emotional roller coaster. There's a lot of peaks and a lot of valleys along the way. Intermixed throughout the psalm are anguish and assurance moments, is what Derek Kidner calls them. There's moments where he is assured of God's protection in his life, and then there are moments where he honestly talks about the suffering and the difficulty. And again, already I find that should be an encouragement to us. Again, as we mentioned on Monday evening, so often when we think about discouragement and suffering in ministry, that's not to say that every part of ministry is discouraging or that every part of marriage is discouraging, right? There are these little pockets. There are these moments where we see the Lord at work, right? More often than not, discouragement and encouragement, suffering and thriving, there is a dynamic mix of both of those together. In the opening verses, listen to how David calls out to the Lord. And the movement from David to the Lord, as we see in so many of the Psalms, is this. Something hurts in my life. Something's wrong in my life. Let me bring it to the Lord, right? If we think about the majority of the movements of the Psalms, essentially that is what the psalmists are doing. They are simply identifying what is wrong in the world, and they're saying, let me bring it to the Lord. Two things to note here then that, in my opinion, I think enable David to do this, to enable David to bring these hardships to the Lord. The first of which is this, is that David knows God's character. He knows the character of the one that he's coming to. Psalm 31 abounds with reflections and reminders about who the Lord is. 3 different times in the chapter, in 7, 16, and 21, the steadfast, the hesed love of the Lord is mentioned. God's righteousness is mentioned, his strength, his safety, his security, his faithfulness is mentioned, his knowledge of who David is in David's situation, his goodness is mentioned. Derek Kidner writes this. He says, the good grounds of David's appeal then is this. It's not David's persuasiveness, but it's God's righteousness. It's not David's persuasiveness, but it's God's righteousness. And again, I find encouragement there, right? Isn't that a relief for us together, pastors and pastors' wives and ministry leaders, that the grounds of us coming before the Lord is not our persuasiveness or our need, but it is rather the character of the Lord. John Calvin writes this. He says, David confirms his hope from the consideration of the nature of God, who cannot deny himself and who will always continue like himself. I remember one time David Pallison, in talking about the Psalms, says this. He says, if we were to sum up the Psalms, we might say the Psalms essentially describe our fundamental human need and then connects that fundamental human need to an attribute of who God is. God, I am in trouble. God, you are my refuge and my fortress. God, I am in trouble. God, you are my safety. God, deliver me. And that is exactly, I think, what we see here in Psalm 31. Pallison writes this. He says, a psalm speaks in experiential categories, inviting you to fill in details of what you are facing and how you were either struggling or being blessed. The promises of God in the Psalms, steadfast love, faithfulness, mercy, blessing, watchful care, refuge, and the like, they speak directly. They can also be filled out with New Testament details that show how every promise is tangibly yes in Jesus. Steadfast love and watchful care come to you in a person. Too often, I think as pastors, we can have a theological and a theoretical understanding of God's character, but yet not know God's character personally. And that's not the sense or the vibe that we get from David, which brings us to our second point of not only does David know God's character, and he knows it in a cerebral way, in a cognitive way, but even deeper than that, David knows this Lord that he is talking to. He knows this Lord personally. Right? You don't come to a God that you don't know personally and ask what David asks. Right? David doesn't come nervously to the Lord in Psalm 31. You remember the centurion in Luke chapter 7, verse 6? The centurion who's seeking to get Jesus' help. In Luke 7:6, the centurion front ends it. He says, Lord, don't trouble yourself. Lord, don't trouble yourself, right? The centurion doesn't know who Jesus is, but David knows who the Lord is. And so in verse 2, he says, Lord, incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Robert Alter, who in his translation of the Psalms writes this. He says, the literal sense of this Hebrew verb should be preserved because it suggests an urgently anthropomorphic image of God bending down to hear the speaker's prayer. Right? This idea of incline your ear to me, it is not of a distant God who is disinterested and indifferent to the cares of his people, but it is like a father getting down on his knees and telling his young child, okay, come a little bit closer. I can't hear you. Whisper and speak into my ear. Right? God is no Fraser Crane, right? I grew up watching Fraser, the psychiatrist from Seattle who would log onto his radio show, right? Every day people would call into Fraser and Fraser would be completely detached, completely distracted. He would log on, he would say, hi, you're on the line with Fraser Crane, and I'm what? I'm listening. But he wasn't, right? Fraser was really never listening to people. God is no Fraser Crane. He's a God who inclines his ear to us personally. Listen to how personally David speaks of the Lord in this passage. Look at verse 3. You are my rock, my fortress. For your name's sake, you lead me and you guide me. Look at verse 14. I trust in you, O Lord. I say you are my God. Verse 15. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and my persecutors. Verse 16. Make your face shine on your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. Verse 21, blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his steadfast love to me when I was in a besieged city. Friends, these are the words and the heart cries of one who is in an abiding personal relationship with the Lord. David knows who the Lord is, and he knows this personally and deeply. This is what enables David to come to the Lord. There's no sense of hesitation, no sense of fear at all in coming to him. John Rippon, in his hymn, How Firm a Foundation, writes this. He says, how firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he hath said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? Friends, how often do we allow the suffering in our lives to keep us from finding refuge in the Lord, right? We know and we preach things about who God is, about how he listens to us, but oftentimes there can be a disconnect in our own personal discouragement where we don't do that, where we don't come to the Lord. Maybe just even take a moment right now and consider why that is hard for you. Why is it hard for you to come to the Lord? You know God's character. I know that. You preach and teach and live it on a daily basis. So how is there a disconnect between what you know cognitively and what you live out functionally? What might be difficult about that for you? Well, let's continue. Not only does David come to the Lord, but David also names what is broken. He names what's broken. Now, commentators note that verses 9 through 24, if you look at even the way a lot of times the text will be set apart, verses 1 through 8 are a section, and then verses 9 through 24 are a section. And many people say, well, verses 1 through 8 are kind of a summary of David's suffering, and then in verses 9 through 24, David almost retells it again, and he retells it in greater detail. Calvin and others note that there's probably several different biographical points in David's life that could have potentially served as the background and context for this psalm. David was in a lot of trouble at a lot of different points in his life where he found himself hemmed in and facing enemies. But again, I find that this is in some ways quite an odd encouragement to all of us, right? Ministry is a difficult place. There are people that oppose us. There are people that speak against us. There are people that you go to the grocery store and they see you and they turn the other way. There are people that spread lies or gossip about you. And in that way, again, we are more like David than we are different. That's the norm if we look at David's life. Constantly opposed, frequently betrayed, and oftentimes let down. What we see then in verses 1 through 8 compared to 9 through 24 is that David will start off by describing his suffering generally, but then he moves on to describe his suffering specifically. Just allow your eye to glance down at some of this section. Look at verse 7. David kind of begins naming what is wrong. He says, I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love because you have seen my affliction. Now, this is the same word that in the New Testament, Steve mentioned for us in 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about being afflicted. The idea there is being hemmed in, being crammed and confined, this idea of being caught in narrow straits. David says, you've seen my affliction and you know the distress of my soul, right? Big picture, you know affliction and you know distress. But then notice how specific David gets. David's been delivered into the hands of an enemy. His eyes are wasting away from grief. And that idea there of eyes wasting away from grief, Alter describes as one's energy, his drive, his desire, and his ambition have left him, right? It's another way to kind of poetically put it, that his eyes are wasting away. Not only are his eyes wasting away from grief, but David says, so do my soul and body, right? This idea that suffering only affects us spiritually and not physically is something that we have to dispense of, right? There's no disembodied notion here of suffering, but suffering affects the totality of who we are, both physically, emotionally, spiritually, and relationally. David says his life is spent with sorrow, his years are spent with sighing, his strength fails, his bones are wasting away. The mysterious enemy of verse 8 that he talks about generally now transposes in verse 9 to adversaries. He's an object of dread to his acquaintances. People who see him, they move away from him. They don't move towards him. He's forgotten. People treat him like he's a dead person. He feels like a broken vessel. He hears the whispering of others. He says in verse 13 that terror surrounds him and threatens to encircle him and trap him. And just a note there in verse 13 where he says, I hear the whispering of many. I see and hear terror on every side. That's a phrase that Jeremiah picks up. Jeremiah uses that phrase of terror on every side 6 different times in his book. I think that what is so helpful then for us to note here is that what we realize is that God does not shy away from the particulars of our heartache and struggle, meaning that God never asks us to simply summarize our suffering, and neither does he ask us to sanitize our suffering. You see, none of us suffer theoretically or in the abstract. Again, that's something else that David Pallison was so helpful in helping me understand, right? Nobody suffers in the abstract. We suffer in the real world. You suffer as an embodied being. And what we see here in Psalm 31 is God doesn't say, hey, just be really brief about it. Could you kind of just wrap it up, just talk about your affliction in general, right? And clean it up a little bit. It's not that bad. Hey, you really should be thankful for this. No, he invites us. He says, no, don't summarize or sanitize it. Be honest about it. Name what is broken. God in the Psalms is constantly inviting us to do this. Be specific about what hurts. Now, here's the irony again for all of you. In many ways, this is the work that you do in pastoral ministry and shepherding and counseling. People come to you with hurts and struggles, and it is your privilege to come alongside them and to help them. But here's the rub that I found in working with pastors is that we can be experts in telling others to do this, but amateurs at doing it ourselves. We can be experts at walking other people through the theological dynamics of suffering. We can talk about suffering, God's purposes in suffering, but we can be amateurs in actually applying those truths to ourselves. Again, the hymn writer writes this, "When through the deep waters I call thee to go, the rivers of sorrow shall not overflow. For I will be with thee, thy troubles to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress." And the hymn writer goes on to explain it even further. He says, "When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient will be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine." Friends, we can't name what is broken, and we cannot acknowledge what is broken and bad if we don't speak these things out, if we don't bring them to the Lord. And the Lord invites us to be painfully honest about these things. So let's regroup and reorient for a bit. In our suffering so far, we've seen that the first movement is this: we come to the Lord. Secondly, we name what is broken, but there's a third movement that I think David wants us to do, and that is this, that he wants us to identify what is good. Where is God up to good in our lives? And where does David see God up to good? And again, I'll say the same thing on the opposite side of not only do we not suffer in the abstract, but God's goodness doesn't come to us abstractly. God's goodness comes to us in real form. And naming what hurts, David bookends the section with an astounding expression of his belief in trust in God. Look at verse 6 and in verse 14. David says, "I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord." And then verse 14, he says, "But I trust in you, O Lord. I say you are my God." In the midst of naming what's hurt, there is intermingled throughout this chapter. There's good everywhere sprinkled like nuggets of gold. In verse 15, David talks about his times being in God's hands. In verse 19, he talks about how abundant God's goodness is to them. In verse 20, he talks about hiding in God's presence and being stored in his shelter. In verse 21, he talks about how the Lord has shown steadfast love to him in wondrous ways. In verse 22, he talks about the Lord hearing his pleas for mercy when he cries for help. What this reminds me of, again, is that while you and I oftentimes might want to compartmentalize the hardships of our life, the Lord invites us to speak about all of these things, and sometimes all together, both the bad, the hard, and the good. Here in this section, let me just draw your attention again to a few things. If you notice in verse 6 how David identifies the choice that we all face in the specter of human suffering. He says this, he says, "Listen, will you cling to worthless idols, or will you trust in the Lord?" Again, I think Ron was so helpful last night in talking to us about identifying, being ruthless in attacking our sin and understanding the idols of our heart. Christopher Ash writes this. He says, "In whom do we trust for what we most deeply need in times of suffering? In whom or what do we trust for what we most deeply need?" Right? Let me ask you this morning, right? Who or what do you want to turn to in times of suffering and hardship? What captures your affections? Right? What captures your imagination and your appetites? What promises to relieve the burdens that you carry? Right? When you are burdened and when you are heavily laden, what alluring voices tell you, hey, if you just do this, it'll be a lot easier, right? David says, will you cling to worthless idols or will you trust in the Lord? In verse 22, David cries out for help and the Lord gives him mercy. Right? David is a man who is confident and who understands this, that when I cry out to the Lord for help, the Lord will give mercy. Again, the hymn writer is so helpful here. In his next stanza, he says, "Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed. For I am thy God, and I will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, I'll help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand." That brings us then to our fourth and our fifth heading, and these are a bit more brief because oftentimes, as the Psalms do, as I know you're familiar with, at the very end of the Psalms, typically the psalmists do something. They tend to make a turn from talking very personally and singularly to begin moving out and asking other people to either join in, repeat what they're doing, or to copy what they're doing. That's exactly what David does here in verse 23. He invites someone else in. He says, "Love the Lord, all you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride." Again, like many of the Psalms, the psalmists, they're never content to merely let this prayer of lament be a private exercise of faith. No, we realize that these are invitations extended to you and I to join in on their lived experience. David realizes that the lived experience of what he is going through, what he's going through in his discouragement, what he's going through in his suffering, that at the end of the day, these are things more likely than not to be done in community, to suffer together and to suffer through discouragement with those around you. This missional aspect of the Psalms keeps us from privatizing lament and struggle, and again points us to this reality that we've noted several times throughout this week, that we are meant to live in community. We're meant to be people who need friendships and who need friendships to help with discouragement and suffering in ministry. Do you see the play on words here too in verse 23? David says, "Love the Lord, all you his saints." And here saints is the adjectival form of hesed, right? It's the Hesidim, right? God is calling all of the faithful ones, all of the saints, right? And what I think is so helpful here to note from David's psalm is simply this: we become what we behold. We become what we behold. Love the Lord, all you his saints. And we are saints and we become saints as we reflect on the steadfast love of the Lord. When we gaze and when we look and when we abide in the steadfast, faithful love of the Lord, we in turn become like him. We realize that it's his faithful love that transforms and changes us. Well, David invites someone else in, but he invites them in to do something with him. In verse 24, the closing verse, David says this. He says, "Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord." In the final verse, David continues his call to his friends to join him in waiting and hoping for the Lord. And as we talked about on Monday evening, this hope and this wait is just not a feeling. It's not a naive optimism. It's something that we do. It's an active disposition. It's an action that we do. Also, I want to draw your attention to an alternative translation that Kidner proposes in his commentary. Kidner says this. He says, quote, "Let your heart take courage," could equally be translated, "He shall strengthen your heart," as is reflected in the Authorized Version. Kidner goes on to say this. He says, "The latter probably seems more meaningful, an assurance of help to those who count on it." An assurance to those who count on it. He shall strengthen your heart. If Kidner is right, then the promise of the Lord's strength to those who wait on the Lord makes sense to us. We know that our hearts oftentimes grow weary. We don't want to hope. That takes a lot of work, and it can be difficult and discouraging for many of us to do that and to practice that. And so it's at times like that when we are weary and grow faint that we turn to the Lord who can strengthen us. Again, the prophet Isaiah writes this. He says, "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He doesn't faint. He doesn't grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who what? They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Isn't that such a relief to us? Again, all throughout this psalm, there are these points of encouragement and relief, right? We don't have to be strong enough to muscle our way through suffering and discouragement. It's the Lord who helps us. It's the Lord who aids us in our weakness. And it's because of that, as Paul will say in 2 Corinthians, that we can then boast in our what? In our weakness, right? Because it's in our weakness, it's in our inability, it's in our incapacities that the power of the Lord is on display. How might the Lord strengthen our heart? Well, one way, here in Psalm 31 in particular, is through, I think, the actual promise of the psalm itself. And go back to verse 5. And again, I know verse 5 will be a familiar one for us because we hear the words repeated so often. But we know the words are repeated in a very particular and poignant way by Jesus himself in Luke 23. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, and faithful God. Friends, you and I this morning can take heart because we know that at the end of the day, Jesus was ultimately hopeful. He was the patient, long-suffering one. He was the faithful one in a way that you and I never could be. Jesus Christ lived the life of Psalm 31. He prayed the prayer of Psalm 31:5, and in doing so, those words can become ours. Christopher Ash writes this. He says, quote, "You and I are reading a psalm that is first David's, then supremely belongs to Jesus, and then belongs to us in Christ as the people of the King." Jesus, our anchor and our living hope, precisely because we can't live out verse 24 perfectly. We are weak and our hearts grow weary and we lose courage. But Jesus didn't. It's in the face of suffering that he was strong in the Lord. When his heart grew weary, he entrusted himself to the Father. When suffering seemed overwhelming, he faced it head on. Ash continues. He says, "What will it take then for you to trust the God and Father of Jesus at all times, and even in the face of discouragement and death itself? It takes first some time to meditate on the trust that Jesus himself showed in his God and Father." Again, the final stanza of the psalm, or the hymn rather, that we have been reading along. The writer writes, "The soul that on Jesus has leaned for repose, I will not desert to its foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never forsake." So friends, let me ask you this morning as we seek to make application, what would it take, what would it look like for us to practice what David does here in the psalm? What would it look like for husbands and wives, right? If the invite others in, right, is actually an invitation for husbands and wives this morning, what would it look like for you to do what David does in a season of hardship? To be strong and to take courage and to wait for the Lord. Well, I want to just offer in the time that we have left just a couple of different ways that we can do this. And in marriage counseling, this is an exercise a lot of times that I'll do with married couples. There's typically 6 different steps, but as Alistair says, oftentimes you are smart, sensible people, so I've reduced it down to 3. So you guys get 3 steps because I know that you are so good. The first of which is this: what do we do and how can we actually take what David does here in Psalm 31 and actually incarnate and embody these truths for our marriages? Well, the first thing that we can do is we can practice awareness and attentiveness to one another. We can practice awareness and attentiveness to one another in marriage. David cries out to the Lord because there is a confidence that the Lord will hear him. There's a confidence that the Lord's going to incline his ear to him. And I guess the question I would say to you is, does your spouse have a similar confidence in you? That when trouble comes, that you will be aware and attentive to what is going on? Right? Awareness and attentiveness, and I tell husbands this especially, it's not just knowing that you have a spouse and that they exist, right? That's the baseline level of awareness and attentiveness, right? We're looking for more than that. We're looking for something deeper. Awareness and attentiveness is about actually loving the individual that the Lord has placed with you. One of my favorite books was written by Paul Miller called Love Walked Among Us. And Paul has this line in Love Walked Among Us where he says, loving begins with looking. Loving begins with looking, right? Looking at your spouse and loving them. We see this movement from Jesus himself, right? Throughout the Gospels, we see that Jesus sees people and he what? He has compassion on them. He sees them and he has compassion on them. What are ways that you can cultivate this in your marriage, right? What are ways that in seasons of discouragement and hardship, you can be aware and attentive to your spouse? Well, first of all, it is sacrificing oftentimes what is difficult for us, and that is our time. We actually have to give up time to be aware and be attentive to our spouse. The great French ethicist Simone Weil said that attention is the purest form of generosity. Attention is the purest form of generosity. Just asking yourself, hey, what's going on in your life? What would you like to talk about? Right? If we use the language of the psalm, or at least the invitation of the psalm, then maybe the words that we say to our spouse in seasons of discouragement or hardship is simply this: hey, what hurts? What hurts? You seem down. Your countenance has fallen. You seem a little bit off. I notice you seem a bit more withdrawn. You seem a bit more sad or downcast. Is everything okay? Would you talk? Would you share with me? Now, it also can be the opposite. And again, I want to make sure that I add that caveat that not all ministry is horrific and discouraging and seasons of suffering. There's also a lot of good that happens. And so these questions can equally be turned to the positive. Where do you see God up to good in your life? Where's the Lord blessing? Where's the Lord turning his face and shining it upon you? So that's the first thing. Practice awareness and attentiveness to your spouse. Now, secondly is this, and this is a movement now that begins to move you a little bit deeper than what we just talked about, and that is this: turn towards your spouse. Turn towards your spouse. Or if we use the language of the psalm, incline your ear to your spouse. Turning towards your spouse means a willingness to actually enter into their suffering, entering into their world. When your spouse makes what we call in marriage counseling a bid for connection, a bid for awareness. Maybe they throw out, hey, do you want to do something tonight? You want to go for a walk? You want to have a conversation? We call those bids in marriage, right? They're trying to get your attention. They want to engage and connect with you. What will you do? Will you be indifferent to those invitations or those requests, right? Imagine if the Lord didn't incline his ear to us. What if the heartbeat of Isaiah 59:1 were not true? Right? The prophet Isaiah says, behold, the arm of the Lord is never too short that it cannot save, and his ear is never too heavy that it cannot what? That it cannot hear. Turning towards our spouse then is a willingness to reach out when you sense the other one needs connection. We might say it's being emotionally available to your spouse. Turning towards them means that you care enough with the other person or for the other person to actually engage them, right? What would this look like for you to turn towards your spouse? Not to just be aware and attentive, but actually move towards them, right? For some of you, it might be putting down your phone or putting down the TV remote. Maybe it would be simply maintaining eye contact. I see so many couples in marriage counseling who can't even look at one another because there's either so much conflict or hardship in the relationship. Maybe it's saying no to a commitment at church, right? So that you can turn towards your spouse. So you've been away for 4 nights of the week, and turning towards your spouse means you say no to this engagement so that you can rightly say yes to your spouse. Again, I think Ron was so helpful in that last night in talking about finishing well, that one of the lessons is investing in your family, investing in your marriage. And oftentimes, I think, like he said, we completely invert that. We put ministry at the top, even over God, right? So instead of it being God and our spouses and our family and then ministry, we completely invert that order, right? Slowing down and turning towards our spouse then might mean saying no to a commitment at church. Additionally, when we turn towards our spouse, we also want to be mindful or negative of hard or difficult emotions that might come up for us. A lot of times in marriage counseling, a part of growing in this area of turning towards your spouse is realizing that sometimes the reason why it's hard is because we have our own negative emotions that we have to deal with in the midst of turning towards our spouse. For some of you, it might be hard to turn towards your spouse because you might feel judged. You might feel embarrassed. You might feel like you might get rejected, right? So in turning towards your spouse, it's actually a step of vulnerability, but there's been times where that vulnerability has been rejected or abandoned. And so the emotions inside of you say, well, don't turn towards them. It's just a lot easier to be like ships in the night. It's a lot easier to just go your separate ways. Others of you, it might be different. It might be, I don't feel heard or I don't feel listened to. Being mindful of those negative or hard emotions is a positive step then in understanding why turning towards your spouse might be difficult. And again, think about the Psalms and the psalmist, right? So much of what we see in the Psalms are essentially people bringing negative or hard emotions to the Lord. Well, we are aware of our spouse, we're attentive, we turn towards them. Thirdly and finally, a way that we build this connection in our relationships is we seek to engage in understanding. We seek to engage in understanding. Now, what are some ways that you and I can cultivate understanding of our spouse? I'll say this at the outset. A troubling thing I find in marriages, especially younger marriages, is that there is a ton of build-up in the dating and engagement phase. We want to know everything about our spouse. We are putting our best foot forward. I liken, premarital and engagement phase to like used car sales, right? We wash the car, we make sure everything looks great, and then after marriage, you begin to look under the hood, and you're like, oh man, like the engine doesn't work, or the transmission's broken, right? Everything looked good on the outside, but there's some things that are not working well on the inside, right? We realize that in marriage, we can get a little bit lazy, especially those of us who have been married a long time, at actually understanding or getting to know our spouses, right? We can kind of coast on and plateau on a body of knowledge that was developed 30 years ago of our spouse, not realizing that we're dynamic human beings. We change, our affections change, things that we like change and grow. And so in engaging and understanding, we want to know the person that God has placed with us. Let me give you 5 simple ways that you can do this. 5 very, very easy ways to do this. The first of which is this: be quiet. Be quiet. Listen. Listen to your spouse. Simply allow them to speak and allow them to talk. Secondly, keep your words brief if you do speak, right? James's admonition to us, I think, is a good one, that every man should be what? Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And I always tell people in counseling, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. So it seems like the ratio there, at least somewhat intentionally, is to do more listening than we do speaking. A lot of times I'll have couples come in and they'll be talking and one of the two spouses will just monologue. They'll just go off for minutes at a time, and you can kind of see the other spouse's eyes just glaze over a bit because this is what they experience day in and day out in their home. Their words aren't brief. There's not an opportunity for dialogue. It's more of one spouse monologuing to the other. Proverbs 17:27 says, whoever restrains his words has what? Knowledge. And he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. Thirdly, ask good questions. Ask good questions, right? Ask questions about what's going on in your spouse's life. Ask them questions about how they might be feeling about a particular area. Ask them questions about their day. Ask them questions about what's hard or difficult in their life. Again, Proverbs 20, verse 5, the author says, the purposes of a man or a woman's heart is like deep water, but a man or a woman of understanding can draw it out. Fourth, and I think this is important, you can see there's perhaps a bit of a progression of being quiet, actively listening, keeping your words brief, asking good questions. But fourth is don't get defensive. Don't get defensive. One of the things that I see in marriages that breaks bids for connection is defensiveness. When we get defensive and when we get stubborn and get engaged in these protracted conflicts, we're not able to connect with one another. What are ways that we can make sure that we're not defensive? Well, first and always is to pray. To cry out to the Lord in that moment, to help your words to be on the shorter end rather than on the defensive end, right? Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Focus on what your spouse is saying, not on what you want to say next. Right? Oftentimes we get defensive because we're actually not even listening to the content that our spouse is telling us. Instead, we're trying to practice and rehearse in our mind what it is that we want to say to defend us from some allegation or charge that we believe they're going to make. Number 5, so be quiet, keep your words brief, ask good questions, don't get defensive. 5th, make requests, not demands. Make requests, not demands. Right? A lot of times in couples counseling, we'll listen to couples and how they talk, and they tend to, instead of making a request, they'll make demands or they'll make these broad brush statements. You never make time for me. You put everyone ahead of me. right? The church is more important to you, right? You don't spend any time with our kids. They come out as demands or these allegations, these sharp words. And then what tends to happen, right? In our sinfulness, our temptations, we want to get defensive, or maybe we want to stonewall or walk away from the conversation. And part of marriage counseling then is trying to help couples make requests, to make bids for connection rather than demands, to say, hey, I've been feeling isolated the past week. I was wondering if you and I could have some time together tonight, just the two of us, to talk and to catch up and to connect. Right? When we learn to make requests and not demands, it helps us actually build connection with our spouse rather than disconnection. All of this, when we do all of these different things, ultimately what we're looking for is to build an empathetic, strong relationship with our spouse. We're trying to do in many ways what David was doing in Psalm 31. Right? He's calling out to other people in verses 23 and 24, and he's saying, listen, let's do this together, right? I can pray this prayer. I can come to the Lord. I can name what is broken. I can identify what is good. But isn't it so much better if we do this together? If all his faithful saints come and we embark on this journey of waiting and hoping on the Lord together? Let's read verses 23 through 24 again to close our time. David says, love the Lord, all you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong. Let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. This invitation that David closes with to the faithful ones, it's an invitation to join him in a season of suffering. And what is so wonderful about the time that we have together this week, and hopefully the time that you have as you head home to your own locations and churches and contexts, that husbands and wives, you have a built-in person that God's given to you in ministry to do this with, to build connection with during seasons of discouragement and suffering, to deepen and to strengthen your faith. You can, in many ways, defy the conventional wisdom that suffering is always negative, that it always tears people apart, and you can actually live out the biblical truthfulness that no, suffering can actually have positive effects on relationship. It can bring individuals closer to one another, and it can ultimately bring individuals closer to the Lord. May he help us in that. Let's pray. Lord, we come to you this morning, and like David, we can come to you and we can ask you to incline your ear to us with zero hesitation and with zero doubt that you will hear us. Lord, you are a God whose arm is never too short that it cannot save, and your ear is never too heavy that it cannot hear. And Lord, that hopefully should fill us with a spirit and a sense of gratitude and thanksgiving and humility. Lord, that the God of the universe would incline his ear to us. And that in this inclination, Lord, you invite us, you invite your faithful ones, the ones who have looked to you, that your face has shone upon. You invite us to speak honestly about our suffering. You don't ask us to summarize and get it over quickly. You don't ask us to sanitize it and make it nice and just have a silver lining on everything. You invite us to speak honestly about those things. And so, Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters here this morning that for those who have perhaps bottled up discouragement and suffering, who have felt embarrassed to share it, or have felt like maybe that's complaining or venting, Lord, that you would give them the grace and the mercy to be able to come to you, knowing that when we cry for help, you will be merciful. You will give us mercy. Lord, remind us of that and help us to do that. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.